Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's public lecture on behalf of the Rethinking Crisis Working Group here at the John F. Kennedy Institute and the Graduate School for North American Studies. We're a group of researchers funded by the Einstein Stiftung, and our purpose really is to both do our own work on rethinking the crisis of capitalism and democracy, but also to bring the brightest stars and the rising stars from global academia and intellectual scene to Berlin to make as many connections as possible with intellectuals, activists, academics and thinkers here in Berlin. So this is why we chose Jason Moore to come from his new position at Binghamton in New York State, where he works at the Fernand Braudel Center. We've noticed Jason Moore's work really on capitalist world ecology, which brings together discussion of the accumulation of capital and regimes of capital accumulation with the production of nature in a dialectical unity. And in a way, Jason Moore's thought is absolutely groundbreaking in this area, where there's a return to discussions of materiality and materialism across the social sciences after the exhaustion of the cultural turn. But Jason is one of the few thinkers on the world stage who's applying and reworking historical materialism to address this crisis and intellectual juncture. So Jason is teaches history of world ecology at Binghamton. His forthcoming books next year are Ecology and the Accumulation of Capital, which will be published by Verso, and Ecology and the Rise of Capitalism. He serves on the editorial boards of Review, the Journal of Agrarian Change, and the Journal of World Systems Research. And his articles have been recognized with the Alice Hamilton Prize, the American Society for Environmental History, the Distinguished Scholarship Award of the Section on Political Ecology of the World System American Sociological Association. I mean, I could go on for ages if I read out this list of prizes, awards that Jason's received. So maybe I should shut up and let Jason speak for himself. So I'd like you to welcome Jason here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's my extraordinary pleasure to be here. I want to thank Larry Reynolds for that kind and gracious introduction and for organizing my trip here to the Capitalist Crisis Workgroup, for having me here. And what a pleasure it is as well to have Professor Altvader in the audience. His work is absolutely groundbreaking, and indeed I regard it as foundational to the world ecology arguments that I and my colleagues, and now a growing group of PhD students at Binghamton University and elsewhere, are trying to advance. So above all, how I want to approach this lecture is in terms of an invitation to a broader conversation about how we get beyond this nature-society dualism, this what I call a Cartesian dualism after René Descartes, although of course he doesn't deserve all of the blame. That this notion of the Cartesian dualism, that we have human relations over here in one box that are social relations, and we have relations over here in another box that we call nature, that we call ecological relations. That far from being separated, these are, in the modern world system, above all, intimately connected in ways that are unprecedented in the history of humankind, that our relationship within the web of life is more intimate, denser, and more expansive than at any time in human history. And if humans are indeed a part of nature, if humans are indeed specifically harnessed natural forces, in the words of Marx, then that has far-reaching implications for our methodological premises, for our conceptual frames, and for our narrative strategies. These are based on a dualism of society and nature. And it seems appropriate to paraphrase the oft-quoted Einstein observation that the thinking that got us into a problem is unlikely to give us a solution to it. I would say that nowhere is this more clear than in the current state of capitalism in the biosphere today and the ongoing evolution of global warming and a series of biospheric tipping points that we are now in the midst of. So what I want to talk about today is this question of the talk of Anthropocene or Capitalocene, age of man or age of capital. So this is really a question of history and why history matters. Of course, as Faulkner said, the past isn't past, it's not even over. That history is 5 minutes ago as well as 5 centuries ago. And I would begin with the obvious, that the bounding of a historical process decisively shapes what we see in time and space, and that how we think the origins of a problem shapes how we conceptualize the solutions to that problem. So the Anthropocene model gives us, I would suggest, a model of history in which history doesn't really matter, in which history has been replaced by time, in which geography has been displaced by space. And so there is a mode of reasoning and narrative strategy premised on time, space, and quantification over the history, geography, and the development of relations of power, production, and reproduction in the web of life. And so this is the first point to think about, is how do we distinguish between the very real geological facts of the Anthropocene argument and the historical facts that emerge as human beings are bundled up with the rest of nature at every turn in making and unmaking relations of power, production, and reproduction. So, of course, with the Anthropocene, which has become such a popular buzzword these days, we have an extraordinarily wide range of possible interpretations, but one is dominant. And this is the idea that the Anthropocene begins right around 1800, that it is characterized above all by rising greenhouse gas emissions, rising fossil fuel use, beginning in 1800, but clearly accelerating by 1850, and then again after 1945. So what we have with the Anthropocene argument, and the dominant argument is really pioneered and articulated by Earth system scientists, people like Will Steffen, Paul Crutzen, the Nobel Prize winning chemist, and also the environmental historian John McNeill. What I wish to suggest is that there are two overlapping approaches to the Anthropocene argument about periodization. One is about the search for significant stratigraphic signals, so the search for golden spikes. This is an exercise in geological history, or the pursuit of geological facts. I think considerable confusion and a considerable lack of clarity emerges from the confusion of geological facts with historical facts, and I'll speak more about that in just a moment. But the other part of the method of the Anthropocene, and this is a method that is replicated across global environmental change studies, even in Marxist versions like that of John Bellamy Foster and his colleagues, is the search for significant environmental consequences. Environmental consequences of what? Well, of social relations somehow purified of their constitutive relations with the rest of nature. So there is at the core of the Anthropocene, and even the dominant red and red-green narratives of modernity, a notion that social relations are ontologically prior to the environmental consequences that they impose. I want to suggest that consequences are real, they are important, they are relevant, and that if we have a mode of historical interpretation based only on consequences, we are left without an accurate picture of the world around us and an accurate way of discerning the strategic relations of power and production and reproduction in the modern world system. So, what I would say, paraphrasing Marx, is that coal is just a rock in the ground. It only becomes a fossil fuel when it becomes bundled up with definite relations of class and capital and empire. And so we need to keep this distinction between geological facts and historical facts, that is, the emerging tendencies of history, in Lukács's wonderful turn of phrase, as distinctive elements in a historical method that takes extra-human nature seriously, but does not succumb to a kind of dualism in which somehow a nature operates out there and humans are outside of it. What I want to say is that, yes, human nature is distinctive, but it is not exceptional, and that human nature always unfolds in relation to the web of life, and that everything that humans do is, in fact, co-produced. That capitalism makes nature and that nature makes capitalism. There is something that I will speak about in a few minutes. This is the double internality, that history that humans are involved with is always co-produced. And if we lose sight of this, or we make this kind of philosophical statement after the fact, but continue to generate a series of narratives and methodological premises based on the separation of humans from the rest of nature, we will run into severe problems, not only of historical interpretation, but also in our efforts to deal with climate change today and the other rather pressing and urgent task of the biosphere, including the human relations within it, those questions of, say, food security, surplus humanity, emerging infectious diseases, and so on and so forth. That we need to understand that these developments are at every turn co-produced and bundled with the rest of nature. So, there is a very familiar ring to the Anthropocene argument, and it fits well with a long-standing environmentalist critique. What does it say? Well, the Industrial Revolution is the great boogeyman, the great specter of environmental crisis, that the problems come from two things, steam and coal. I want to suggest that this is not only theoretically problematic, but it is historically false. And that although industrialization of the particular form that takes place in the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century did indeed represent a qualitative transformation of capitalism, it did not represent a fundamental transformation. That the relations of power and production and nature, both in terms of symbolic praxis and in terms of technological development, the operation of capital, of empires, that these decisive relations formed in the long 16th century, between 1450 and 1640, and that it is there that we can see the origins of not just an ecological crisis outside of the relations of capitalism, because I don't think that such a thing exists, but indeed the many-sided crisis of the world today, in which the sixth extinction and the onslaught of global warming are unthinkable except through the developments of financialization, of capital accumulation, of new resource wars, and so much more, that we must dispense with the notion that ecology can somehow be separated from power and production and reproduction, from the central questions of how humans relate to each other. These are never separate from those of the biosphere as a whole. So, we have this very familiar argument, and indeed the Anthropocene argument takes on a very familiar and long-standing kind of bourgeois inflection. And I don't say this in a polemical way, but the standard operation of bourgeois environmentalism is to say that the problems of the environment are the making of all humankind. Now, and this means that the anthropos, or the anthropos, becomes an undifferentiated whole. And perhaps that's an okay place to begin. But if it's where we end up, we have a problem. I would suggest that one of the distinctive characteristics of humanity is its fundamental differentiation. Is that intra-species differentiation has to be a fundamental starting point. So, and then the other part is that we want to look at this consequentialist bias of environmentalist thought. That we want to look at the way of thinking through environmental problems as deriving simply from the consequences of modernity or industrial society or capitalism. Pick your favorite term. But what I would say is that instead of seeing consequences as the only way, or as the primary way to think through, we need to think through capitalism, industrialization, modernity, and so forth, not only as producers of changes in the biosphere, but as products of it. That modernity is not only a producer of change, but a product of environmental and biospheric change. And that's why I suggest that the long-standing arithmetic of environmental studies, this green arithmetic that says society plus nature equals the whole of the biosphere, is irreducibly partial. I think that society plus nature was a necessary place to begin in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. I think that it was often a profound and powerful challenge for the early pioneers of environmental studies to establish that this object, the environment, was indeed a legitimate object of analysis. Today we all take this for granted. The environment is a legitimate object of academic analysis, that we have departments, we have programs, we have journals, people can build careers around this. And what I wish to suggest is that now this is also a source of theoretical impasse, and indeed an impasse of the imagination of green thought. And that in some ways we have yet to move from the philosophical premise that humans are a part of nature, and to translate that philosophical premise into workable analytics, and from there into workable political strategies. Although in some respects, I think, especially in terms of food sovereignty, I think that the movements are ahead of the intellectuals in this respect. So this is what I would say, that the choice is between capitalism plus nature, and that is the dominant radical and critical narrative today, or capitalism in nature. And that means also, of course, nature and capital. So this means when we speak of capitalism as world ecology, that we see the accumulation of capital, the pursuit of power, and the co-production of nature as an organic and evolving historical totality, in which these three moments, and we could certainly articulate more beyond this, but these three moments are a point of departure. This is a methodological statement for how we begin to think through a post-Cartesian, a post-dualist approach to humanity in nature, to capitalism in nature, and, if we are fortunate, to socialism in nature. So these are not three discrete or fragmentable moments that each is implied in the other. And so in this sense, when I speak of the Capitalocene, I don't speak of simply imposing some Marxist or other critical rendering of an ideal type on history, but rather to take capitalism, or the capitalist world ecology, as a methodological premise in which capital, committed to infinite self-expansion, operates as a kind of gravitational field. Marx liked to talk about the gravity of capital, and it seems to me that this is an apt way to describe it, because, of course, capital is not a mechanical determination. It's been taken as that too often, and it's been criticized as that too often. But indeed, in gravitational flows, fluxes and flows, we have plenty of contingency. And so this means, as I've said, that capital is co-produced by human and extra-human natures. And I'll say a bit about what I mean on that in a few minutes. And this also means that the Anthropos is differentiated. So this is, capitalism as world ecology, therefore, offers one of a series of alternative approaches that emphasize a post-Cartesian method. But in contrast to actor network theory, object-oriented ontology, and assembly approaches, what we offer is a way to talk about power production and reproduction over long time and large space. That there are indeed durable centers of power. There are strategic rules of reproduction that govern the lives of humans and the rest of nature over very large spaces. And that the task of coming to terms with whatever we mean by a global biospheric crisis today, that task demands a post-Cartesian approach that is much more relational than what we have seen before, and that in order to tackle that, we need a way of talking about the biosphere as a historically concrete totality. So, what we want to do is to speak of world ecology as a framework for theorizing rather than as a particular theory unto itself. And we try to ground this by emphasizing that nature is always historical, that we can start with nature in general, much like Marx starts with production in general. But it would be silly indeed to study the history of, say, flexible accumulation in the neoliberal era of capitalism with the concept of production in general, as it would be to study the transformations of nature in the era of neoliberalism with the concept of nature in general. And yet that is precisely what critical global environmental studies has done. So we need to understand that historical capitalism and historical nature are a co-produced and evolving whole. And in this, we ask the question, well, ecology, as conventionally understood outside of human relations, is it ecology or is it oikos? Oikos I've stolen and appropriated from Theophrastus, the Greek philosopher and also botanist. And I've used this in conversation with the important arguments of people like Richard Levins and Richard Lewontin, amongst many other critical natural scientists. And when we speak of oikos, what we do is say that oikos is a way of naming the creative and generative and multi-layered relation of species and environment, including centrally humanity and the so-called social structures or social systems that they create. That this is irreducibly multi-layered, so that when we speak of world, we always understand that we are dealing with worlds within worlds. There are always layers within layers. There are no basic units in the universe. There are simply different webs of relations. And in this, I would also emphasize that humanity and the relations of power and production that humanity have forged over our species' history are an unbroken circle of doing, being, and thinking. That thinking is not somehow outside of the realm of the production and co-production of nature. And this is important because symbolic praxis is the missing ingredient in all too many radical analyses of the global political economy and the global environmental crisis. That we need to understand that ideas matter. For Marx, let us remember that ideas, when grasped by the masses, are in themselves a material force. And I say, well, is that not true also for the bourgeoisie in its period of ascent 5 and 4 centuries ago? So, when we talk about capital, the initial proposition is that the substance of value, abstract social labor, premised on socially necessary labor time, that is the average labor time involved in the production of the average commodity, that the substance of value is non-identical with the relations of value. And I'm going to say more about this in some specific ways. The trope of critical environmental thinking has been to say that nature is exploited. Of course nature is exploited. Look at all the terrible things that modernity does to nature. Nature is exploited. But this is not exactly right. And I think that it's disarmed the left and critical explanations of capitalism in nature. That, as the old Marxist joke has it, the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited. And in fact, the only thing worse than being exploited, I would say, is being appropriated. So capital accumulation works as a way of transforming the work energy of the oikos, of the biosphere within reach of capitalist power, into abstract social labor, into capital. But this occurs only partly through the exploitation of labor power in the commodity system. It occurs largely in tandem with the exploitation of labor power and through which it forms a dialectic. This occurs largely through the appropriation of the unpaid work energy of human and extrahuman natures. The appropriation of the unpaid work energy of women, nature, and colonies in Maria Mies's stylized formulation. What does this mean? This means that every act of exploitation through wage labor depends upon a more expansive act of appropriating the unpaid work energy of the rest of nature. This is the great insight of the otherwise absurd discourse on ecosystem services. Of course, if capitalism were ever forced to pay for ecosystem services, accumulation would grind to a halt. It would be impossible. But what it suggests is that every act of commodity production and exchange depends upon a much more expansive array of appropriating the work energy of extra-human nature. But also, let us remember, and here is one of the contributions of a post-Cartesian method, is that it's also suggested by the Marxist feminist argument, and which ultimately was taken up by the United Nations Development Program in the 1990s and since, of the centrality of unpaid domestic labor. So, I would applaud Nancy Fraser for saying that these are central to an expanded definition of capitalism, but I would go further. I would say these are not background conditions, but foreground conditions. That the production of surplus value depends crucially on the appropriation of the unpaid work energy of women, nature, and colonies. And the impasse that we find capitalism in today it turns crucially on the inability of capital and empire to find new ways to secure new and expanded flows of unpaid work from women, nature, and colonies, from human and extra-human natures. So the value relations depend on one part exploitation, one part appropriation. And this dialectic is central to the production and co-production of abstract social labor in the modern world. So, just to remind you, capitalism is the accumulation of capital, the pursuit of power, the co-production of nature as dialectical processes. That this means a double internality, that capitalism, like all civilizations, brings in nature and is organized by the rest of nature at the same time as it seeks to organize the rest of nature. This is something that Marx stumbles upon when he talks about the most fundamental process of any human civilization, which is the labor process. That in acting upon external nature, Marx's words, we transform ourselves. But not only that, we transform the relations between humans and the rest of nature, what I am calling the oikos. So I'm going to move beyond this to say, we'll get to the historical material very soon, but that one of the crucial moves that we want to make is to move from environment as object, environment as noun, to environment as verb, from environment to environment making. And that we want to understand that environment making necessarily extends far beyond earth moving. It moves far beyond clearing the forests, making the dams, planting the fields. It goes to new scientific, agronomic, botanical, mapping, quantifying, rationalizing procedures that are at the heart of modernity. Thus, I was enormously pleased when I saw Professor Allfather say that we need to include the Weber's European rationality of world domination, that we can take that even farther, that it goes beyond rationalization to a series of, in Vito Kula's words, metrical revolutions, of mapping revolutions, of surveying revolutions that go all the way from the cartographic revolutions of the 15th and 16th century to remote sensing by satellites in the present. And that these are about establishing nature as fungible, as quantifiable, as interchangeable, as ultimately part of establishing nature as a way, in a way that is necessary to and facilitating capital accumulation. This is what I call, in a fairly general way, abstract social nature. So, today we're at an interesting point, and I think that we're really at a paradigmatic turning point in thinking through humanity and nature. And there's a curious bifurcation that has transpired. On the one hand, regional scale investigation in political ecology to some degree in science and technology studies, in environmental history, regional investigations have broken down this dualism. While on a global scale, both for the Anthropocene advocates and also for the Marxist metabolism school, there is a hardening of the dualism. To see, once we deal with global transformation, it seems that we are delivered a set of dualistic narratives in which the crises in this way of thinking converge. The crises of finance, say, converge with the crises of biodiversity or climate. And this only makes sense if you presume that these are autonomous developments in the first place, which is, perhaps I'm an old-fashioned historian in this way. Financialization, for instance, is fundamentally about claims on the future material wealth of the world system. These are not separate phenomena. So what I think we really want to question is this dualism, and also this way of treating resources as agents unto themselves in a kind of retrofitted environmental determinism or fossil fuel determinism. I think more helpful is an approach that signals the way in which capitalist relations of power and production seized upon coal to produce fossil fuel, and that fossil fuels were, yes, indeed, constitutive of a new era of capital accumulation, so that we can move from resource determinism to resource determinations, in which resources become resources through their bundling with definite relations of power and production. So this is clearly the case with coal. So we need to always remember that resources only become resources in the context of definite relations of power and production, and that indeed all these major relations of power and production in the modern world are related centrally to ways of extracting unpaid work energy from the rest of nature and transforming it into capital through this peculiar way of valuing reality, which says that work within the wage labor system is what is valuable, and everything else will be used as a prop to advancing labor productivity in the modern world. So the historical argument, we've gone through some of the theoretical and methodological frames, but the historical argument runs something like this. First, the origins of modernity are to be found in the long 16th century, and that this modern world system is a capitalist world ecology. So this does not deny, far from it, the turning point of the middle 18th century. Rather, it accentuates and explains the truly epoch-making significance within the capitalist relations of production and reproduction as a whole. And so this allows us to move beyond the consequentialist bias in some very, very important ways, and I think allows us to get closer to the real nature of the tipping points, which are irreducibly bundled between humans and the rest of nature in the present moment. So what is almost universally forgotten is the audacious and epoch-making landscape transformations of this period between 1450 and 1750. It is almost universally invisibilized, both by Greens, Red Greens, and mainstream theorists, although I was very pleased to see that Fischer-Kowalski and her colleagues in a recent article said, yes, indeed, the 16th century is the turning point, and they are, in my view, absolutely correct. That early capitalism was indeed real capitalism. The prevailing view of early capitalism between 1450 and 1750 as pre-industrial or as merchant capitalism is, in my view, historically an unsupportable hypothesis. That is, that those concepts are not well supported by the historical evidence. And what I want to emphasize to begin with is the quantum leap forward between medieval Europe, say in the 14th century, and capitalist Europe in the 16th century, that you have a quantum leap in the scale, the scope, and the speed of environmental transformation, often by an order of magnitude. My favorite stylized fact is that in medieval Picardy in northeastern France, it took 200 years to clear 12,000 hectares of forest in the 12th and 13th centuries. 4 centuries later in northeastern Brazil, That was achieved in 1 year. No help from fossil fuels. Thank you very much. So we have a fundamental shift in the scale, scope, and speed of environmental transformation. And what I'm going to put out there for you to think about is that this shift, this world historical quantum leap in the scale, scope, and speed of environmental transformation was fundamentally linked to the emergence of a new form of valuing reality, which in the Marxist tradition we call the law of value, but we can say more simply that labor productivity came to displace land productivity. No longer, as it was during feudal Europe, was the question, how many bushels of rye or wheat could you grow on a hectare of land? The question rather became, how many tons of sugar could you produce every year per slave, per hour of work? So it became a labor productivity system. There was a world ecological revolution in this period that broke decisively with the patterns of landscape transformation in pre-modern civilizations. And I've mentioned feudal Europe, but we could say, tell similar stories, very broadly conceived, of imperial China and many other places around the world. And what we see in this era, this early Capitalocene era, was a new systematic combination of earth moving, of mechanization, and of symbolic praxis, perhaps represented most readily by the era's scientific revolutions, but also decisively revolutions in time and space, in tracking what E.P. Thompson, the great historian, would later call the industrial time. But industrial time does not begin in the 18th century. Industrial time begins in towns like the textile producing town of Ypres, which operated as essentially one large factory in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. That we have the origins of new forms of conceptualizing space, the emergence of Renaissance perspective in painting, which was closely bound up with new forms of map making. That you could lay out the whole world in front of you, and this was part of a broader revolution in ways of seeing reality in which space was flat, time was linear, and nature was external. So this means, to borrow from Lewis Mumford's term, that we need to look not just at technology, but at technics, at the broader technologies of power, that are symbolic, that are material at the same time. I think that it is a great illusion to say that we can separate in any nice and tidy way the symbolic and the material from each other. So that means that when we think of capitalism, we need to move beyond this notion of capitalism as the zone of commodity production and exchange. We need to understand that commodification is always dialectically bound to strategies of appropriating the unpaid work energy of the rest of nature, of women, nature, and colonies. And that this process of appropriating the rest of nature is not simply one of primitive accumulation, although that is always there, the role of force, the role of empires, the role of state violence, but those are always short-run strategies. They can work, maybe for 5 years, maybe for 10, maybe for a bit longer, but they are insufficient to establish the new conditions for the accumulation of capital. So you need new forms of symbolic praxis, new ways of seeing, new ways of knowing. Reality, as I mentioned, Max Weber's The European Rationality of World Domination, but going much, much beyond rationalization. The revolutions in capitalist relations are always ontological and they're always epistemological. Somebody asked me at a conference I was recently speaking at, do we really need ontology to deal with climate change? I said ontology is already in the climate problem. Okay. So, here we need to remember that revolutions in landscapes and revolutions in ways of measuring and knowing reality go together. That what we see in the long 16th century is concretely this new world of quantifiable abstractions, new cartographies, new forms of survey and property making. You have no capitalism without property relations, and you see property relations, new bourgeois property relations, not only emerging in England, where you can read literally whole libraries of great historical geography, but also in places like Madeira, in the 1470s, in the heart of the sugar revolution there. Also in Brazil in the 16th and 17th centuries. You see new schools of painting and music, new, more metered, rationalized, regularized ways of representing the world. New philosophies, of course, of mind and body, of nature and society, of economy and nature, of the earth and the cosmos. A new relation to books through through mechanical printing that was fundamental. And these were bound up in this epochal shift of environment making. For those of you who are more curious, I have a list of 25 major episodes. I boiled these down to about 10. And I'll run through these very fast, because what I want you to do is to sort of take this in as a way of thinking through some of the bigger questions of modernity and nature and the crisis historically and in the present. So, of course, crucially, we have the internal agricultural revolutions of the Low Countries first, and then England, and later, by the 19th century, of course, it globalizes to the United States. I was speaking about that yesterday. But this early modern period of internal agricultural revolutions premised on sharply rising labor productivity in the heartlands of the maritime Low Countries, and then after that in England. You have commodity-centered mining and metallurgical revolutions beginning in Central Europe between 1450 and 1550, and then also moving to Northern Europe, England, eventually to the Americas by the middle of the 16th century. You have a sugar commodity frontier that, yes, leaves a trail of cleared forests and mass graves in its wake, but the crucial point is to say that the cleared forests and the mass graves of African slaves were the concrete consequences of this new mode of appropriating human and extra-human natures to advance labor productivity. So there was the same process that looks very different in core and periphery of advancing labor productivity within agriculture. You have, in the case of what I've called the sugar commodity frontier, an entirely new tempo, an entirely new rhythm of environmental change that is wrapped up with the origins and globalization of cash crop agriculture. For those of you who are interested in food and industrial agriculture, its origins go back to the sugar slave commodity frontier system in early modernity. That what is striking about this is roughly 45 to 70 year cycles from one leading region of the world sugar economy to the other, that we see not limited to sugar, but in fact across the major primary sectors of the early capitalist world ecology. We see this in fisheries, we see this in timber and forest products, and we see this in mining as well. So, but these frontiers were not just, environment making was not just about landscapes, but also about moving human populations. So every time this sugar frontier moved geographically, you also saw a slaving frontier move geographically. That there was a story of the exhaustion of the profitable potential, if you will, of one region after another after another. So clearly today sugar is still grown in Brazil, but what you saw was the recurrent exhaustion in one region after another of the profitable potential of these regions, that their competitive edge was lost as they ran through the capacity of extra-human nature, soils, forests, water, and so forth, to provide the work energy, the unpaid work energy, to make them competitive. You have mining transformations all across the New World, but also crucially within Europe. That the story of the rise of capitalism is neither one inside of Europe or outside of Europe, but a dialectic of those transformations. That we need to get beyond the old sort of stylized version of the Brenner-Wallerstein debate, because it is more a question of both and than either or. Crucially, that without the extended Baltic from southern Norway to Poland all the way into the Baltic and Finland, you would not have been able to build the shipping fleets that carried the wealth of the New World into the metropolitan heartlands of places like Amsterdam, London, and elsewhere. So, and you would not have been able to build these huge fishing fleets that spread the net of appropriation across the global North Atlantic between these eras. And so we had, of course, forests were transformed everywhere at an unprecedented pace. And one of the things that I like to point out is that neither a low nor a high energy return to energy invested is necessary for capitalism to function in the abstract. We rather have a historical set of conditions for what becomes necessary as capital accumulation evolves historically over the longue durée, and that what counts is energy returned on capital invested. And this was the great insight and the great sort of genius of early capitalism, which was to use the surface of the earth and its wealth as a form of fixed capital. And Marx makes a comment about that that's very insightful and I think is pregnant with implications for a post-Cartesian approach. And, oh yeah, if we're going to talk about coal, the coal revolution doesn't somehow materialize out of thin air in 1700. It begins in 1530. Why does it begin in 1530? Because the coal revolution in England is bound up with a world ecological revolution that stretches from, by the end of this period, by around 1700 or 1750, that stretches from Southeast Asia to Brazil, to the Baltic, to the far north of North America. And of course, finally, we have the Columbian exchange of Old World and New World flora and fauna and disease, an exchange that was far more than a passive process of the rest of nature hitching a ride onto the ships and trading routes of capitals and empires. So this is all crucial to understanding environmental history because these transformations occurred at such a rapid pace and such a wide scale because the transformations of the earth were used to advance labor productivity. And crucially, this was not an era of inert technological development that somehow in the critical environmental critique, we have forgotten that early modernity, early capitalism, was just as industrial as later capitalism if our standard is a relational and relative standard, that is, relative to what came before. By the way, medieval Europe was was a society full of machines as well that we often forget as well. But what I would simply run through, and I'm not going to go through every element of this, is that you have a series of technological and mechanical innovations that dramatically increase labor productivity in shipbuilding, which as early as the 17th century was using standardized parts, was using water-powered sawmills. That we have the emergence of new economies of scale, the blast furnace revolution, whose heartland was in Germany in the 15th and 16th centuries, is a good example of this. We have the printing revolution in textiles. We have new technologies that treble labor productivity over a century and a half or so. With the Sager process in metallurgy, we have all sorts of new technological developments that indeed, as capitalism expanded over this period of time, we saw a whole series of mechanical innovations alongside new configurations and class relations of production on the ground. And so what I would emphasize is that we remind ourselves very clearly that the transformation of the earth and the accumulation of capital, and in more precise terms, the production of relative surplus value, is these are always dialectically bound with each other. And this suggests that we get rid of this, really, I think, at this point, a very misleading way of thinking history of pre-industrial and industrial, merchant, and others. I do think that the advent of large-scale industry, of English-led industrialization in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, was indeed a crucial developmental phase of capitalism, that it was qualitative, and at this point that fossil fuels are indeed central to the reproduction of capital. I think there's no question about that. But I think what we want to be careful about is we need to be on guard against reifying and fetishizing some of these Marxist categories that have indeed all too often been reified and fetishized. So the other part of this that I've made this point already, but I want to come back to it because I think too often today in global environmental studies we've been treated to a materialism that is much, much, much too vulgar. That ideas matter, that science matters, that ways of rationalizing and regularizing and quantifying the realities around us, both the human and extra-human realities, that these are fundamental to the relations necessary to maintain a very weird system of endless capital accumulation, of endless growth as an end unto itself. So symbolic praxis has to be at the heart of this. And here indeed we see a whole series of very modern rationalizations, above all those premised on space, time, and money in the early modern world. That we see this with the emergence of the Dutch East India Company. What do? First of all, is they establish a geography department. They set very detailed and precise instructions to their ship captains to map the shorelines everywhere they go, to collect the flora and fauna of the rest of the world. That these were also intimately connected with hydraulic engineering and other forms of landscape and property making that were crucial to this era. We see work time subjected to a radical rationalization. And we see for the first time at the dawn of the 17th century the creation of a nexus of world money and world nature. That the material basis for this was indeed the American silver flowing into Amsterdam from Potosi that provided the conditions for the rise of fiat money. But this was also the emergence of world money that was bundled with the rest of nature. That it was always the money, as Tim Mitchell points out, is always material as well as calculative. Those two moments are bundled together. The rationalization and material transformation of the world in service to capital accumulation are always bound up with each other. So we find for the first time the emergence of derivatives with the rise of the Amsterdam Bourse. We see 360 different commodities traded by 1638. And it was in Langley's nice turn of phrase that the Amsterdam Bourse, the stock market, provided the symbolic rationality for universalizing and intensifying world credit practices that were central to the environmental transformations and deforestations from Bahia in northeastern Brazil to the Vistula Basin in the period 1600 to 1650 and beyond that. So this again does not deny the turning point of the long 18th century and the rise of what we call industrialization, but it emphasizes that that era of mechanization and the new appropriations of fossil fuel energy were kind of amplified by the relations that were already in place. And so what we want to highlight is that this was an era of what I would call a developmental crisis. And the developmental crisis is a fundamental crisis of a long wave of organizing wealth, power, and nature that can be resolved in the modern world through new rounds of commodification. So the crisis of global Fordism in the 1970s was clearly resolved through neoliberal strategies that sought to extend the zone of commodification. That was a developmental crisis. The crisis of feudal Europe in the long 14th century was an epochal crisis because we saw a fundamental revolution in the mode of producing wealth, nature, and power. And it's also instructive to remember that this era of the long 18th century was one of profound crisis. So we get a lot of our classical political economy from this era, and it was deeply inflected by this era of profound capitalist crisis, not least the work of Thomas Malthus, who writes during a period when agricultural productivity had indeed stagnated, when, because of the dispossessions of previous centuries, you had new patterns of urban family formation that did indeed allow for population to rise. You had a particular historical moment that resembled, in a highly stylized way, Malthus's theory. And indeed, David Ricardo was deeply afraid that rising food prices in this era, which occurred not just in England, but across the Atlantic and across Europe, that these rising food prices would throttle industrialization. So what we saw was a shift from these horizontal or terrestrial frontiers of the early capitalist era to a concert of, if you will, vertical or subterranean frontiers with horizontal frontiers. But the basic process was one that was very similar. It was appropriating the unpaid work energy, in this case, of fossilized carbon. The work literally of millions and millions of years of the Earth system working out its relations of organic and inorganic matter. So the era of fossil capitalism crucially allowed for a shift from the main kind of crisis in capitalism, from underproduction, that is too few inputs to the factory gates, to overproduction, that is too few customers. And yes, I realize that these are both accumulation crises and have to do with profitable investment, the availability of profitable investment opportunities. But nevertheless, the key heuristic distinction remains that we have a shift right around 1800 between underproduction crises of the previous 3 centuries and the overproduction crises that have continued to this day. What we need to ask today is whether or not we are seeing the return of underproduction crises. This is clearly signaled by the most unusual, the longest, and the most expansive commodity boom in modern world history since 2003, where the prices of food, metal, and energy have remained at historic highs for the past now 11 years. These were supposed to undergo a market adjustment after 2008, and they never did. And this is suggestive of some deeper contradictions that are now coming to the fore of capitalism that suggest that we may not just be going through a developmental crisis, but also an epochal crisis of capitalism. So, what does this tell us about limits? I mean, this is the big question, and the big question about limits is, well, historically we've seen capitalism overcome these major, seemingly insuperable limits before. People say, well, the limits to growth in the 1970s, they ended up to be untrue. Well, there are two questions going on. One is at a very, very general level of abstraction, where we do understand that clearly there is a finite amount of accessible copper, accessible oil, so on and so forth on the planet. When that will run out and when that won't is a very abstract kind of question and not really a historical question. The question is, how can those free gifts of nature be extracted relatively cheaply? And that's a historical question. And so we're not seeing the end of oil, but we are seeing the end of cheap oil and its equivalents. We are seeing the end of cheap food because of climate change, amongst many other class and chemical and energy contradictions of the capitalist agricultural model. But we need to understand that these limits are always produced limits, or co-produced limits. And this means that nature is not external, that its energies are not somehow drawn down through geological exhaustion, although there is an element of truth in that, but that geological and biological change co-produces both opportunities and limits. So what is a limit for one civilization may not be a limit for another. As we know, capitalism is a tremendously wasteful and inefficient system when it comes to the wealth of extra human nature and indeed the squandering of human nature as well. So we should be wary of what I would call neo-Malthusian invocations of limits as external. That's how I read the legacy of Malta. It's not about population in itself, but about limits as being somehow outside of history. But no, limits are always inside of history. That doesn't mean that human beings get to decide what counts as a limit, because limits are co-produced. And so what I would say is that if we start with nature in general, or limits in general, that we always seek to move towards successive historical determinations. That we take nature in general as a starting point, but that if we leave it there, we end up with nature as a violent abstraction that is abstracted from the real historical relations of humans in the web of life. And I would say here, I absolutely applaud what Nancy Fraser has been arguing in the recent New Left Review, that yes, we need to understand that capitalism is a system not only of capitalization, but of capitalization of production in concert with relations of reproduction, the reproduction of human and extra-human natures, and that this involves a theorization of the relations that have sustained capitalism as one part capitalization or exploitation within the commodity system, but also appropriation through symbolic praxis, cultural fixes, and yes, force over the longue durée, and that what we are seeing today is a dramatic shrinkage of the opportunities that capitalism has to appropriate massive new streams of unpaid work energy from the rest of nature. And we can see this not just in the commodity boom. It's not just cheap food, cheap energy, and cheap metals and other raw materials that are really in the dustbin of history. That those cheap resources are not going to come back, but it's also cheap labor power. And you see this dramatically in the wage and price data from Chinese urban and manufacturing wages over the past decade. And I've written about this more in an essay called The End of Cheap Nature. So, the limit of capital is, and I say something that always irritates the environmentalists. I say the limit of capital is capital itself. And they say, how can you say this? Because, of course, the way that Marxists have talked about capital is in a social reductionist way. That it is a social relation outside of nature. And if capital is a social relation outside of nature, then it's absurd to say the limit to capital is capital itself. But if capital is co-produced through the web of life, that is precisely what we are seeing. The limit of capital is indeed capital itself, that the relations and contradictions of the biosphere enter into the determination of capital today, into the determination of socially necessary labor time, and into the determination of what Marxists today are calling over-accumulation. That is, the accumulation of capital over and above what can be profitably invested. And the transformation of the biosphere, both in its cyclical moment since the 1970s and over the longue durée, has created a situation in which the free gifts of nature are no longer so amply offered up. And that is creating a massive contraction in the opportunities for the investment of surplus capital. Hence, we see a rising mass of capital going into financialization. So financialization is a way of organizing nature. And we have to get very smart about financialization and political economy for the environmentalists and for environmental studies scholars. But also the political economists need to learn that nature matters. And that nature matters beyond a place of dumping your waste and of drawing inputs. That it's a much more dialectical and fundamental relation than that. And so here we can look at these relations in a historical and evolving way, and to begin a discussion of limits as a methodological proposition rather than as a series of tablets that I've just brought down from the mountain saying, look, the limits are here. No, we need to begin a discussion of what limits really mean and to move beyond natural and social limits to see that limits are always in and through the oikos. Thank you very much.
That was brilliant. And now, hopefully, everybody can see why we brought Jason Moore to Berlin. And you can see the connections between his work and Nancy Fraser's work on Beyond the Hidden Abode. So without further ado, I'd like to open the floor to questions, contributions, provocations, mini manifestos of not more than 3 minutes. So fire away. And also there's a bit of paper circulating. Can you please sign it to keep in contact with our future events, etc. It should be around the back of the room. Yes?
Thanks for the talk.
Would you like to speak up?
Yes. I'm in sympathy with your way of kind of redescribing the Anthropocene and also in trying to overcome the culture divide. What I'm maybe a little bit concerned with is the question whether in your narrative it doesn't seem that there has only been capitalism so far. So I'm wondering, with regards to our current ecological crisis, what do you make of the Soviet Union, for instance, or the ideas of industrial socialism? In what sense would they differ from our current situation?
Not at all. The Soviet developmentalism, the first question we ask is, from whom did the Soviets learn, for instance, industrial agriculture? Well, it was the Americans. And what's Lenin's favorite phrase? Electrification is
electrification plus Soviets equals socialism.
Yes, so electrification plus Soviets equals socialism, which clearly it did not. Not to give Lenin too hard a time here, but it's clear that these so-called socialist projects were by and large thoroughly modernist, and that in my view the Soviet experiment looks very similar to a lot of other so-called capitalist experiments across the global south in this period. And I see very little discontinuity with the dirigisme of Soviet developmentalism and, say, Tsarist developmentalism. I mean, how does Russia engineer its entry into the capitalist world ecology? Well, it does so under Peter the Great and state-led development. So meet the new boss, same as the old boss.
More hands, please? Yes.
I have many questions or also comments to your speech, but we have not so much time to discuss it all today. Tomorrow is a workshop, and then perhaps we have more time to elaborate on that. But one question perhaps is important. You mentioned 4 limits to the capitalist development, or to the development of the Capitalocene, but you did not address the question of distribution. I think it is important because limits and also the modes of overcoming these limits are unevenly distributed among populations, social systems, individuals, and so on. And perhaps overcoming these limits then means conflictuality, conflicts between people, and how to deal with them. And it is not necessary to introduce or to integrate this problem into your discourse. Mm-hmm. The question of conflicts, not only of power structures, but also of open conflicts, even military conflicts can be the outcome. A second question which I have, I wonder, you're very much building on Marx, and that is okay, I do the same, I try the same. So we are brothers in thought. But the other hand, I wonder why you didn't mention in German, Springpunkt, the central issue as Marx called it, the double character of labor, the double character of the commodity, the double character of capital. And I think that this is a very good approach to understand the dynamics and contradictions of the Capitalocene, because the one side of capital, in this double character, the one side always is nature. And the other side is the value system, that is accumulation. That is not the contradiction or the counterposition in green thinking, but it is one entity, capital, which combines both nature in capital, capital in nature, as you called it, and vice versa. And therefore, I think it would be very fruitful to try to integrate more this notion of the double character into the discourse on the Capitalocene.
Well, I think that I'm in agreement with both of your points. Distributional conflicts in the sense of Martinez-Allier, or in the sense of, can you unpack what you mean by distributional conflicts?
Not only money, but power.
Well, I think that's the question of the class struggle, right? Is that a question? I think that we're at the beginning of a process of reconceptualizing what the class struggle means. And I think one of the concerns that I often hear, and I applaud the concern, is, well, where's the class struggle, Jason? And I say, well, here we need to be very careful between the phenomenal forms of social conflict or class struggle, the obvious forms, but also we need to understand that the accumulation of capital is in itself a class struggle. I think that, so I'm having a hard time historically of nailing down what problem you're getting at with this. Is it a question of how do we conceive of, say, workers' struggles? What happened there? Of the history of workers' struggles, or is it of anti-colonial struggles, or of, say, anti-neoliberal struggles today, or is it something different?
Military struggles on oil, for instance.
But I would not, I think maybe there's an issue of vocabulary there. Okay, that makes sense. I think that the US imperial gambit, for instance, was a gambit to try to secure sources of cheap energy. And obviously it hasn't worked out that way. So that's one part. About the double character of capital and labor, here we have the very real danger of falling back into a Cartesian dualism, because I think it's all nature. And that we need to go, but not in a Cartesian way, not to collapse the distinctions into nature. We have a problem. What I would say is that they're all part of the oikos. So when Marx refers to labor, human labor, as a specifically harnessed natural force, I think he's directly trying to break down that fetish of separating humans from the rest of nature. But I agree. I think that the dual character of capital needs to be pushed forward in our analysis.
Okay, we've got a question here. Shall I take three in a row, or do you want to respond to each question?
Maybe two.
Okay.
Then I might lose track if we have three.
Okay. And while the microphone's moving over there, as Professor Altvater mentioned, there's a workshop tomorrow, which anyone in this room who's interested in this discussion is welcome to. It's in this building, in room 305, at 1 o'clock tomorrow, between 1 o'clock and 4 p.m. Do come and approach us after the lecture and invite yourself to the workshop to discuss these ideas more general. So, Andre.
Okay, I just would like to ask about internal division within this Capitalocene. Because, you know, we have this nature and this Capitalocene, like this big umbrella. But then I think there is a little something missing, that we have to maybe have this plural, like natures, because, you know, when you have this division inside of the Capitalocene, you have the different nature human combination, like different bunch of networks which are creating different attitude to nature, different definition even of nature, and so on and so on.
Different bundles of nature.
Yes, yes. Okay, I think it's this.
And like, so the question is...
Yes, some proposition about this distinction within Because you have this broad term, Capitalocene, but I didn't see these differences, which you have this institution of periphery, central relation, and then you have different natures, even different definition of what human is in some very harsh world, you know. Okay.
Well, so this is the question of how do we understand combined and uneven development between core and periphery in this kind of context? How do we understand class differentiation?
Yes. How to rework this old scheme to this new form of the
well, I think you have stated beautifully the question that I have posed, which is how do we go about reconceptualizing these very large-scale historical processes, including industrialization, imperialism. Is this me with the feedback, or the microphone? There, the microphone is making noise. Whether it's imperialism and industrialization, or the history of particular racial orders within societies, of patriarchal regimes, and say the governmentality of gender, or all of these, I think that we need historical answers to how those look through the oikos, because we understand, I think many of us intuitively understand that humans are a part of nature. And the block, and it's a very serious block, and it's a very serious barrier that we all have to take seriously and make real choices in terms of our lives and careers and politics, is how do we get beyond? How do we get beyond that idea that, say, something like the demographic history or family history is a social process? Well, as anyone who has kids knows, if you can tell me when the biological moment ends and the social moment begins, please enlighten me, because it's all wrapped up and messily wrapped up with each other. And what I would suggest is that is true for all of these processes. And in that sense, I applaud somebody like John Law saying, yes, we need messiness. We need a method that allows for messiness. And I would extend that to what we typically regard as the nature-society divide. That indeed, if we start from the opposite premise, our histories start to look different. So I would say less important than the definitions or the theorizations in the abstract is, let us take a process of imperialism or core and periphery and presume that humans are a part of nature. And I guarantee you that you will end up with a much different story than if you presume that humans are separate, that social relations of power and production are ontologically prior and independent of the web of life. So that's why I say world ecology is not a theory. And in that sense, we bear a lot of resemblance to world systems analysis, which people call world systems theory, but there's no theory there. It's a framework for theorizing. And I think that's what Marxism is, that at its core, it is a method for understanding historical change. So if we take that method seriously and the ontological and philosophical questions, but move beyond ontology and philosophy into historical method, then we will end up with stories and analyses of our world historically, including 5 minutes ago, and also that will allow us new and I think creative politics as well around the present conjuncture.
Yes.
Maybe I just use the first half. When it comes to Anthropocene, I always think about the limits of growth, and I personally think, how do you preserve, or how do you think the respect of a perspective limit to growth, which is basically just not only just reduce less, but also really alternately reshape the economic status quo right now. So how do you think of the concept of limit to growth, and how do we kind of promote or progress this spectrum of limit to growth?
Well, I think the first thing that we should do is to be thankful for Donella Meadows and her colleagues in the early 1970s. That report was, of course, disavowed effectively by the Club of Rome, and so was not exactly popular in ruling class circles. At the same time, we need to move beyond that there are clearly limits, but the limits are not imposed by an external nature. The limits flow from the relations of capital and class and empire in the present moment. That, just to cite the most widely discussed non-limit, if you will, is that there is plenty of food today to feed everyone in the world. And yet, 3 billion people on this planet experience micronutrient deficiencies. There's plenty of energy to do everything to meet human needs on this planet. It doesn't have to be distributed unevenly. So we need to think very deeply about the question of limits and to take out the idea that limits reside in an external and ahistorical nature, that limits are co-produced.
So we had a question at the back.
Thanks. I was just wondering if in this whole analysis of how resources are valued and how we talk about environmental crisis, I was wondering if there might be more of a place for politics and the modern state, because it seems to me that the kind of Anthropocene camp dating of this in the 19th century has a lot to do with the way that the state became involved in resource management and distribution. To take your example of the surveying, the mapping, the geological surveys were conducted towards the end of the 19th century. And I feel like that kind of activity has a lot to do with the dating of this. And also just take your point of departure, which is that our solutions will reflect the way we interpret the origins of this. It seems to me that the solution actually really needs to have something to do with politics in the state, and so should that play a role?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Here I would refer everyone to my friend Christian Parenti's important argument about the centrality of the state in dealing with climate change, that for all the anarcho-communist sympathies that I have and sympathies for the Occupy Wall Street and Occupy movement in general, that we need indeed to have a praxis around state power to deal with something like climate change. So yes, indeed, here I think again we need to have think very seriously about the state as not the domain of society, but the domain of humans bundled with the rest of nature. The example of the geological survey in the United States is indeed suggestive, because of course the American state is a paradigm case of the state being inherently environmental, in the words of Parenti, that the state is one of the decisive ways that humans go about making environments, not just transforming landscapes, but with the example of the geological survey, in fact, if you go back even earlier, the foundation of the American continental state was through a series of mapping, surveying, and cartographic initiatives going back all the way to the Northwest Ordinance of 1783. So, yes, absolutely, we need to become much smarter about states and political strategies in this era. And I think that a social reductionist conception or a dualist conception of the state will run us into tremendous problems that bear some resemblance to that of an earlier era in the history of the socialist movement, when the argument was, well, first we get socialism and then we'll deal with the problems of race and gender. Well, no, we have to do all of them at the same time, because race and gender are in fact constitutive of any socialist strategy. And the same can be said of nature. So what we need to do is to move beyond an additive framework to understand that power is always bundled between humans and the rest of nature, and that it's materially practiced but also always symbolically enabled.
I simply want to go back to the point that you're talking about. I follow you on a lot of issues, but this was always a problem for me.
Yes.
Ignoring the limits. You also know that beyond tipping points, biological systems will collapse. And well, there will be still nature, but one definitely can question whether there can be a social ecological system, the one you have called the world ecological system of capitalism. Therefore, obviously, after collapsing of biological system, you cannot have the same sort of capitalism within nature and nature and capitalism. So there must be a change, and a very tremendous one. So planet can live with this constellation, but obviously we as humans or our civilization cannot. And therefore I don't really understand why I can say, well, actually this debate on limits is an artificial one, because there are no limits, in an absolute way, because there are these tipping points, and if we are moving, it's not simply climate change, you know these tipping points, there are other tipping points, loss of biological diversity, stuff like this, where we are already much beyond the tipping point. And therefore, the question is, what does it mean within your framework?
Well, first of all, if I have communicated myself that I believe that limits are unimportant, I have not communicated myself very well, because limits are absolutely important. To your question, I would pose another, who's doing the tipping?
Obviously not the humans, because people living in Africa, they are not doing the tipping. We know it very well. So actually, this has to do with the capitalist organization of, nearly all.
That's what I would suggest. What I suggest is, far from denying the importance of tipping points, I would say that the work of, say, Kalle Folke and Martin Scheffer, of the Resilience Center folks at Stockholm, the work of David Barnowski, of the work of Eurosystem scientists, that they, within a Cartesian framework, are unable to demonstrate the real historical significance, the translation of the biophysical facts of tipping points into historical facts of systemic crisis. So far from undermining an argument about limits, I would say that a world ecology argument allows us to understand the translation between what Barnowski and colleagues call state shifts, or what Scheffer and Folke call catastrophic shifts, to understand how those biophysical developments and shifts. And I would emphasize that in their language it is one of shifts, and I think that may be a more useful way of talking about it than collapse. I would suggest that this language of shifts, how do we translate those shifts into historical shifts of relations of power and production? And so I see myself and my colleagues in the world ecology tradition as very much respecting and indeed building upon the work of the Eurosystem scientists, that our disagreement is not over the severity of the present conjuncture, but over how do we translate biophysical facts into historical ones. Is that fair? Yeah? Because in a sense, my whole, the theory, the kind of way that I've narrated the history of capitalism is indeed premised on the notion of recurrent limits, and that the limits are very much co-produced. But other possibilities are there as well. And I would say also that the discourse, one of the reasons why I'm sensitive perhaps to this question of collapse is because it too is represented as a historical argument. But in fact, the real historical legacy of episodes of collapse, the collapse of feudal power in the 14th century, was followed by a golden age for workers and peasants. Why? Because you take the parasites out. You take the landlord classes out of the equation by changing the balance of class forces. The collapse of Roman power in the West after the 4th century ushered in another golden age for the peasantries of Western Europe for, depending on where they were, between 2 and 4 centuries. So I would suggest that collapse is not always to be feared in a historical sense as well. And that there is a profound politics of fear undergirding and infusing and permeating environmentalist thought and environmentalist action today. And I would suggest that the politics of fear will not lead to the kinds of emancipatory outcomes that we all would prefer.
So we have another just over 10 minutes of discussion. So, okay, 3 people. You at the back first.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't quite understand the difference between exploration of labor in nature and appropriation of labor in nature. I have been reading your blog, and there was an article in the special that you said that, I think maybe I can be wrong, but I understand that maybe if you use the appropriation category, we don't fall into the dualism Cartesian.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. That's why I didn't quite understand that.
Okay.
Shall we take 2 in a row?
Okay.
Who, if you can remember, yes, please.
I was a little bit wondering, you're coming from a systems approach, but still you're incorporating into nature also all these finite resources, which are classically geological resources. But in order to have a sustainable ecological system where humans can be part of, these can't be taken into the equation. So I don't really get that. And also
wait, can you say that again? What can't be taken into the equation?
That you're including finite resources, oil, coal, gas, all this stuff which is not reproduced within the ecological system and won't be there in the future anymore. How can you include that into nature if you want to have a sustainable model? And
so keep it in the ground?
Yeah.
Keep the oil in the soil? And the coal in the ground?
In order to have a sustainable system, you should include that into nature or ecology.
Okay.
And I also didn't get the point about the difference between exploitation and appropriation, and why you're basically focusing on all the Eurocentric developments, and how much do they differ from antique or pre-antique developments or cultures? Because this sounds, and also sounds a little bit like this contradictive cycles. And do you also agree if there's a downturn after each period of exploitation or appropriation through a technological shift after that?
Okay, should we take another, or should I try to?
Yes, okay, yes, one more.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you mentioned the concept of ecosystem services.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little more on your perspective towards them, and if you see them as a, I don't know, new and big step again towards appropriation of nature.
Well, it's sort of a weird development in the history of mapping nature, the ecosystem services approach. I can just say why I find it useful is because it does speak to this reality that there is a huge amount of work/energy, and I'll try to, maybe I can even tick back up to the beginning of this. Work energy, I mean in a rather generic physics kind of sense. Sorry, we're sort of going all the way up here. Let's see if we can find this, since a couple of the questions were here. Of work/energy, as which I've stolen, of course, from George Capensis, the brilliant philosopher and political economist of work and energy from the Midnight Notes Collective. The ecosystem services just shows how deeply dependent the capitalist monetary system is, and the system of commodity production is, upon unpaid work energy of extra-human nature. The problem with dualism is that what has happened is that the ecosystem services discourse and that kind of spirit of the argument, which does have a very neoliberal and neoclassical cast to it. That's true, but that's become separated largely, except for a few people like Marilyn Waring or Patricia Perkins, become separated from the contributions of the unpaid work energy of humans, overwhelmingly women, in sustaining the relations of reproduction for the wage labor economy. So that's what I would point to. So what I want to point to is in these relations of exploitation and appropriation, since a couple of the questions pointed to that, is that we need to understand that every act of quantification depends on an act of non-quantification or de-quantification, that you can't quantify the whole world, even though that tendency is imminent in capitalist development. And so if you were to extend ecosystem services money valuations to all of the work of extra-human nature, accumulation would be squeezed and would be impossible in the way that it has historically obtained over the past 5 centuries. My point about the exploitation of nature is that it's not so much wrong, but it's polemical, and it has short-circuited an appreciation of how the uptake of unpaid natures, the unpaid work energy of natures has factored into the accumulation of capital. So that the exploitation of labor is necessarily a quantifiable system, and that it depends on appropriating through the relations of power, through largely non-economic relations, the appropriation of the free gifts of both human and extra-human nature. So we need a model of capitalism that goes beyond an economistic reductionism that says commodity production and exchange is everything, because commodity production and exchange only works through its appropriation of the unpaid work energy of women, nature, and colonies. Now, I'm not sure that I really understand the question about non-renewables, so we can talk about that afterwards. Eurocentric, I mean, look, the history of capitalism is Eurocentric. So there's a difference between Eurocentric historiography, however, and a Europe-centered approach. And clearly, the history of modernity is one of capitalism emerging in the Atlantic world. If anything, I think my account decenters Europe by stressing the centrality of North American and other rather New World, North and South American frontiers in the whole process. That capitalism only gets to East Asia very late in the game, as people like Pomerantz and Postdoctoral and other Gunder Frank have pointed out, that capitalism only reaches real power in South and East Asia until the late, not until the late 18th century and afterwards. So there's that. The difference between pre-capitalist civilization and capitalist civilization in terms of environment making is, as I've said, one of an order of magnitude in many cases. The scale, scope, and speed of environmental transformation is simply much, much bigger, faster, and more audacious than anything that we have seen before. Yes, China had its share of socio-ecological problems. It did not seek to deal with them by conquering the world. That was the genius of capitalism, to treat the globe as its theater. Not K-waves. That, in fact, I think nothing in what I've said is about Kondratiev cycles. I would say that we don't really know what K-waves are, because we have found those price movements even in Song China in the 11th and 10th century. We do, however, know that there are durable and reasonably coherent patterns of power and production that obtain over long periods of historical time in over the past 5 centuries. So we do need a way of constructing those historically. In fact, I'm with Giovanni Arrighi in arguing against any kind of K-wave approach, because it has the feel of something sort of a deus ex machina, sort of coming down from outside. And for me, I wouldn't call myself a systems approach person. I would say that what I'm looking for are the relations of power and production that unfold across large space and long time. And I think that gives us a historical way of telling big stories about real places. The global system is not an abstract theoretical construct. It is a real place. And I think that one of the things methodologically that we need to get beyond, and this speaks to the bifurcation within environmental studies between the breaking down of dualism within regional studies and the hardening of dualism within global environmental studies, is that for regional political ecologists and environmental historians, they still treat world history as a kind of theoretical exercise. And it is not. That the modern world system is a real place. Every bit as real as Berlin or Northern Europe or the American West. And that we need to realize that there are a series of methodological and conceptual moves that are qualitatively distinct when we tell the story of large time and large space relative to regional investigation. And this is a point that I've been making both with environmental historians and political ecologists for the past decade, that we need to get over the myth of bigness. And so there are a series of challenges that we, I think, not just as critical intellectuals, but as people concerned about political strategies of the present and dealing with the global crises of the present, that we need to think through very seriously the questions of large time, large space, and long time, especially in modernity, which has created an unprecedented form of large space and long time in the present. So that would be my 2 cents in that discussion.
We have just about time for maybe one more quick round of questions and responses. I would like to ask a question, but also if people can think of one more question. Whoops. My question is, I've used my position as chair. So if you say that central to the rise of capitalism in the long 16th century was both a symbolic and material practice, the symbolic practice of portraying nature as external, then we look at the shifts around the conceptualizations of nature, which seem to be happening at the moment, that nature no longer seems to be this stable ontological realm beyond society, with biotechnology, with a whole range. It seems everybody is trying to overcome nature-culture dualism. And then if we relate this to another problematic, which is that you say that every phase of capitalism has a particular ecology. And so after the crisis, or in this particular crisis period since 2008, we're seeing both a shift in the conceptualization of nature. Can we discern the beginnings of a new regime of accumulation with a different conceptualization of nature? And another level of meaning on this question is, if we look at how capitalism resolved the crisis coming out of 1929, it absorbed a lot of the labor movement and socialist critique. Can capital absorb the ecological critique, combining with this destabilization of nature culture in some sort of new pattern of accumulation?
That's a great question.
And if anybody else has a, yes. Do you want to, shall we do the two?
Yes, please.
Maybe you, in your answer to these two questions, you can also make it your summary conclusion.
Thanks for a fascinating talk and very broadly sympathetic with the arguments. In fact, it was striking to me how much it reproduced a lot of these debates in the 80s between social ecology and deep ecology, criticizing this overly broad category of humanity with very specific problems. But then it also struck me a little bit, then following up on that, how much your own account focused, in fact, on techniques. So that you gave this very sweeping Mumfordian account of science, technology, art, music, etc., which I felt at times was at risk of losing the very specific social, historical, and especially political components that built the linkages between these two. So specifically when you talk about, or you're establishing the earlier periodization of earth-moving, mechanization, symbolic praxis, these are all kind of focusing on the techne, and then you go into the emergence of Dutch capitalism afterwards. The sequence itself somehow seemed revealing that the actual threads, the social threads that were driving that, to me were a little bit absent. And then in one of your answers to the first question about the Soviet Union, you responded that, yes, it was another modernist project, which to me almost sounds like a slip of the tongue that goes back to that techno-determinist view that, well, they're using the capitalist technology, so therefore it's essentially the same beast, which to me flattens out quite a bit of historical, social, political diversity.
Perhaps the Soviet Union is a capitalist project rather than a modernist one.
Maybe it's linguistic, but I think it also, I mean, there's important specificities as well that maybe get flattened out by the broad.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is the unusual character of sort of trying to construct a narrative and framework for theorizing at the same time. So yes, of course, there's more. It's more specific than that, and at the same time, it's hard to argue that the Soviet developmentalist project was anything but thoroughly modernist, and in my view, that would be thoroughly capitalist. And indeed, I think that the Soviet project was thoroughly conditioned by the operation of capital accumulation on a world scale over the course of the 20th century. So I think the point that you're looking to is were there not state and class and other agencies that were involved in this process? Yes, of course. Yes, so I think there's no disagreement there. There's only one cannot do everything at once. And indeed, elsewhere I've argued quite centrally that the crucial to the inability of Europe's ruling classes to reestablish feudalism was the strength of the peasantries, especially of Western Europe, and their capacities to win the class struggle in the countryside and at least in the West to foreclose the possibility of feudal restoration. So in large part this global drive was a product of the class struggle and the victory of the peasantries of Western Europe in pushing states and capitalists out into the Atlantic. So yes, of course, we have a much more complex story that needs to be told, and indeed has been told in different registers by me and others working in this tradition. So that's always important, and I would say that in that regard, that agency does not reside in either human or extra-human nature, but in the bundles of human and extra-human nature. That's what classes are. In agricultural history, access to fertility, for instance, is almost always a class relation. That it's not like, oh, we just went out and found fresh land. It's access to fertility is premised on differentiation and class formation. This question about can capitalism today absorb the ecological critique, the short answer is no. The example, it's great that you mentioned the Great Depression, because this sort of global Fordist Keynesian order, maybe there's a better name for it, was premised on really an unprecedented appropriation of, above all, fossil fuel energy, but much more than that, that there was huge parts of the planet that either needed to be reconstructed or could be absorbed into the relations of capital through proletarianization and other forms of commodification in this era. So we're at a very different conjuncture today. That's why I question some of these arguments from the social democratic left about the restoration of a kind of Keynesian order, because Keynesianism was itself premised on this rather expansive appropriation of global nature in a way that is impossible today. But I would say also that we have the rise of a kind of ontological politics, if you will, from, well, that's really underscored, I think, by the food sovereignty argument that says food in the food sovereignty argument says cultural determination, democratic process, and sustainability and access to and food security are all of a whole. That is, food is ontologically all of those at the same time, which is a radical challenge to the capitalist ontology of food, which says that food is calories, food is yield, and food is money. Really. So what we are looking at, I think, especially around food and agriculture, although we see it in other areas of life today, is the contestation of a modernist ontology of food, and I would say of a lot of the relations of socio-ecological reproduction. These are being called into question politically in a way that is unprecedented. And so food will indeed be and continue to be at the center of politics and the contestation around what kind of world system or world ecology or world ecologies will come next. And the point that I would underscore is that the end of cheap food, of all of the four cheaps that I mentioned of food, labor power, energy, and raw materials, that the end of cheap food is a much, much more fundamental shift than we usually recognize, and that the coming of climate change will so dramatically alter the conditions for agro-food production and relations that we are going to see the end of modernity as we know it as a consequence that capitalism cannot exist without cheap food, that we might see something far worse or we might see something far better come out of it. My bet is on food sovereignty and other movements in spirit, if not in letter, that seek to decommodify and democratize the relations of humans to the rest of nature. And I would say that at every turn we should speak to the ways of unifying the concerns of so-called social justice and environmental justice, because once we look more closely at those, they are indeed intertwined and bundled at every turn. Thank you.
So. That was brilliant. Thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you very much.
We will be organising future events. If you put your name down on the list, we'll tell you about them. And also, we're going for a meal now, but not everyone can come because it's quite a large audience. But we have places for 10, not all of which are taken. And we'd especially like to invite people who aren't part of the Freie University, guests from other institutions and parts of Berlin. So come up and talk to us if you want to have some food as well at our expense. Thank you.